Hello, welcome as people are coming in. Thank you for joining us today. Hello.
Hi, how are you?
Okay, how are you doing? We're just getting started here. Do you want to make sure it works with you have something to show, right?
Yeah, let's do screen share. I mean, I'm mainly going to be speaking, obviously. And let's see the screen share. Yep, perfect. Works.
Well, that was your whole screen, you know, right?
This is better. So I will, no, it's okay. It's okay.
Oh.
I'll divide it like this. Okay, wonderful.
As long as you know what you're doing, that's good. Thank you, everybody who's joining. We give everybody 3-4 minutes, so you had your time to get acclimated here, and
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Screen share works. I'll try it one more time. Excellent. Perfect.
Except that we see your whole screen when you do that. We don't just see your slides.
Yeah. No. It's I just have to open it up here. That's all.
Okay, just as long as you know.
Yeah.
If those who are here on time want to throw into the chat where they're signing in from, that would be great. If you want to share anything about your heritage, I'm putting it in there. Share it with everyone so we know where our people are coming from. I think people are either late today or don't know.
Okay.
Yeah.
Ranana, Israel. Beautiful. Okay, this is very exciting and looking forward. So I'm not sure. There's 40 registered, he said.
No, I said that. I just said it to you, though. I didn't tell it to everybody.
Okay. Right.
But either way, we're going to post it online, so many more people see it afterwards, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Just making sure. And the books did arrive. Thank you.
Oh, wonderful.
Yeah, so excellent. It's very exciting. And we haven't launched yet because we want to do it right. So we're taking a little more time. But We're going to
No
get there.
worries.
Okay. So again, if everybody just wants to throw into the chat where they're from, where they're signing in from today, where they're from originally, we'll give everybody another 2-3 minutes to come in. Yeah, that's the problem is everybody knows they start 5 minutes late. So everybody just starts coming 5 minutes late and then, they start coming 6-7 minutes late and then because that's the way things go.
No worries.
Oh, San Francisco. That's cool. But I'm going to ask you also, it says, so I'm reading your bio, that you're pursuing a doctorate, but you're also receiving a doctorate. And they're two different things.
Okay, so it's currently right now, I'm just wondering if my Bluetooth here works. Okay. Yeah, it works. Okay, wonderful. Yes, so I actually put it on pause in terms of my pursuing my doctorate. So the receiving part's inaccurate, but I'm doing it with, I'm sure you heard of it, in Chicago.
Northwestern Spertus Institute.
Yeah, Spertus. Yeah, so I put it on hold. Just too much work right now going on. So
you're juggling a lot. It's amazing what you do.
Thank you so much.
So I don't like to keep the people that we have waiting. We'll give them 1 more minute, but then we're going to start and people will come in throughout. And like I said, this is, you never know. And thank you for those who were on time. I think somebody heard us waiting 1 more minute and then left to come back in 1 more minute. Okay. Anybody else wants to tell us where they're from? Everybody's being quiet today. Okay. Okay. So like I said, we're going to start. People should be coming in throughout. It is what it is. And we will also be posting it on our YouTube channel afterwards. Very excited. So I am, first, on behalf of the American Sephardic Federation Institute of Jewish Experience, we are very pleased and honored to welcome Rabbi Yehuda Azoulay today. Aren't you a rabbi?
Yes, I typically don't go by the term rabbi, but all good.
You're rather Chacham Yehuda Azoulay. We could do that.
No worries, all good.
Okay, Yehuda Azoulay, who happens to have a rabbinical degree, how's that? And a bachelor's of Talmudic law and a bachelor's in liberal arts, and a master's from Azrieli Graduate School of Jewish Education. And he's been an educator for quite a few years, as well as a scholar. And very passionate about what he does, it seems like, in everything that he does. So it's always exciting to talk to him. I've talked to him a few times at this point, and you will all hear this, I'm sure. He's also an activist. He started the Sephardic Legacy series and has written quite a few of the books from there, 5 of them, I believe, at this point, or maybe more. And really bringing to life the Sephardic legacy. And that's what we want to perpetuate. So we're very happy to be partnering on this today and hope to continue in the future. And for all those of you who are seeing it afterwards, make sure you come next time to when it's live. So nobody came to hear me today. I'm going to hand it over to you. We're going to hear about Rabbi Mordechai Eliyahu, one of the greats, but only one of them. Keep in mind, this is part of a whole huge legacy. So Yehuda, please.
Thank you very much. Really sincerely appreciate you. Everyone can hear me perfectly, correct? Yeah. Okay.
Yes, we hear you. Yes.
Wonderful. Thank you. So first of all, thank you for the opportunity and for joining this. And it's dear to my heart. I give lectures on many different fronts, but when it comes to something of Sephardic Judaism, it means a lot to me personally and in many different aspects. So thank you again for the kind and warm words about myself, but especially we'll just dive right into the world of Sephardic Jewry a little bit, and then as well as specifically and primarily about Rabbi Mordechai Eliyahu. So there's really so much to discuss about the world of Rabbi Mordechai Eliyahu. And to understand his actual world, we have to really understand the type of mindset, the type of social norms, and everything in that particular time, in that particular time and period. So he was born in 1929. His background and ancestral background was from Iraq. And he was born in, as I mentioned, 1929 to Rabbi Salman and Mazel Eliyahu. Something very interesting, which most people do not know and are not aware. Iraqi Jewry in particular, see, last names, I can't say it's recent, but didn't exist at a period in time. And the Iraqi Jewry kept actually a lot of first names to be actually last names. For example, Ovadia Yosef, Rabbi Ovadia Yosef, Mordechai Eliyahu, and the list goes on. And sometimes people get confused from a last name and so on. So his name is Mordechai Eliyahu, and as they use both first names. And just something for that interesting to point out. And really to get into his world is very unique. He comes from the family of the Ben Ish Chai. His grandmother, his great grandmother was the sister of the Ben Ish Chai. So just the fact that he came from that world, the Ben Ish Chai was born in 1835, passed away in 1909. He was, if you want to call him, the chief rabbi of Baghdad at the time, but he was probably the most influential or one of the top influential rabbis during that century. And the fact that he came from that lineage and carries that DNA, if you want to call it, is something special and something very phenomenal. So he's already coming from a rabbinical dynasty, and his notion of focusing on Torah, which we'll get into, is very, very special and unique. As every rabbi sticks out different, but I think we could appreciate, and I believe we could connect, as he was a contemporary rabbi instead of a rabbi from a few hundred years ago. So he was born in 1929, and he was at the age of 26 already. He became one of the youngest dayanim, the youngest judges, and he moved to the city of Beersheba. He was very shocked to see that a lot of the Sephardic Jews were unfortunately mistreated at the time as many different orphans and from all different types of Arab countries. So he actually invested his time and efforts into being involved with a lot of the youngsters of that generation, particularly from the Sephardic countries at the time. And in 19 years old, I have to mention, he was already giving lectures in Porat Yosef. At the age of 11, I'm going actually downwards, and I'm going to go back up. He was an orphan. And his father passed away, leaving him and his other siblings behind. And I was trying to research and document this. I couldn't really find too many rabbis who are quite well known, especially contemporaries, that are actually an orphan. So he was an orphan at the end of the day. And to be an orphan and be a chief rabbi, I mean, he had a very rough upbringing. He didn't have a father figure. So the fact that he went from such granted, he was from a rabbinical dynasty, and he ended up becoming the chief rabbi. I mean, he could have been so shooken from everything, that just in itself, from being an orphan to the leader of the Jewish community, is just something phenomenal. And we see his sensitivity. We see I would call him the most sensitive rabbi and leader ever. Probably one of the most sensitive rabbis that I've ever actually even met. I had the privilege of meeting him at least twice in my life, and a super sensitive individual where everything in Judaism affected him completely. Most people will just completely brush it away. In comparison to him, everything, he was extremely sensitive of every mitzvah and the Jewish people and how he was invested in the Jewish people, which I'll get into later on in this talk. So moving forward in his life, he was approached by Rabbi Isaac Shalom, a Syrian philanthropist, and they came to the Yeshivat Porat Yosef, and they wanted him to be an American rabbi, to go to America and be one of the head community leaders and rabbinical heads. He responded back. He says, "I need 5 years of preparation in order for me to move to New York." So unfortunately, the Syrian community in particular said, no, we're not going to wait 5 years. And he ended up, of course, staying in Israel. Back and forth, he ended up staying, and lo and behold, he started becoming growing into different many positions from Beersheba, Petach Tikva, Yerushalayim, and so on, and then eventually the chief rabbi, which we will get into that period of time. That approach that the New York Jewish community wanted him was in 1951. And then, of course, that didn't work out. A lot of his teachers were a combination of mainly Sephardic rabbinical figures, such as Rabbi Ezra Atiyah, Rabbi Kaduri, the famous Baba Sali, Rabbi Mordechai Sharabi, and many others. But one in particular that stuck out was the Chazon Ish, which is Rabbi Avram Karlitz. And he lived in Bnei Brak. And you could see that how the rabbi was influenced in many different ways, and I guess gave an impression on his person and ended up becoming his personality and characteristic traits. So you could see it's very interesting how the influences of individuals could affect one particular person, and that will affect an entire nation. This is quite interesting. And at the age of 24, he got married to one of his other rabbis in Porat Yosef, in the yeshiva, which is by the old city. If one ever goes to the Western Wall, there's, as we know, Eish Torah, and then many other yeshivas and synagogues and so on. So one of the main ones, as we go down the steps, that's one of the main entrances, that's actually to the right-hand side as one goes down. That is Yeshiva Porat Yosef, which I'll discuss a little bit later. And he married his rabbi's daughter from Morocco, Rabbi Nissim Azran. So his teacher loved him so much, he said, "You're for my daughter." And lo and behold, he got married to the rabbi's daughter. Very, very interesting, and how that occurred. And the Rabbi Mordechai Eliyahu had 4 children, which we'll discuss. One of them is Rabbi Shmuel Eliao, one of them is a lawyer, Rabbi Yosef Eliao, and one daughter who's a leader in education in the state of Israel. So at the age of 28, already he was appointed to a rabbinical judge, one of the youngest ever in the state of Israel. Him and Rabbi Ovadia Yosef were probably the youngest ever in particularly in the state of Israel for being an actual a part of the Bet Din and a part of the judges. So very, very unique. You didn't even have that many, believe it or not, Ashkenazi rabbis at the time that were that young. You see many pictures if you look into that type of that time. I would say 1950s in particular, you'll see a lot of elderly rabbis, both Sephardic and Ashkenaz, and you'll see 1 or 2 Sephardic rabbis that were extremely young in their 20s and a black beard, no gray hairs, and they're there and they're sitting and they stick out. And they're all like 70 and 80-year-old men, 70 to 80-year-old rabbis. And it's something phenomenal to see. And those were the future leaders, and they ended up becoming leaders. He was very active in his youth. He was extremely, extremely active in the Zionistic front, which is not of typical within Israel, in the aspect that most Sephardic rabbis ended up becoming more to the right, if you want to call it. I don't like to label, but more Haredi, if you want to call that. And particularly, he took middle of the road, more Mizrahi, more Bnei Akiva, and a lot of the modern Orthodox and the Zionistic followers who call it Chardal and Mizrahi, or however you want to call them, particularly that type of segmented group, took him as their main leader, which I personally believe they actually lacked at the time. And they had Rabbi Shapira, which was his colleague, and he was literally for everyone. He felt a void, and I actually asked him specifically, why didn't you help with Shas, with Rabbi Ovadia Yosef, which we're going to get into a little later on? And he said this community in particular, first of all, he felt it, he believed in it, and religious Zionism, which we'll discuss. But primarily, he felt a void, and he wanted to be that, I call it, figurehead. As he moved along, his, activism within the years and being involved in many movements. But one thing that sticks out, he never associated himself with any political party whatsoever. Nothing. He wasn't a part of Shas. He wasn't part of Begel. He wasn't part of Likud. Nothing of that sort. Where other rabbis sort of align themselves, and it's still ongoing in terms of aligning themselves with a particular party. So he didn't. He made sure not to. And I believe it was in order to be accepted from every type of Jew. A lot of his colleagues as he got older was Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson, the Lubavitcher Rebbe. He supported Meir Kahana, who was very, very Zionist, as we know his history. And he was very close to Jonathan Pollard, who was released a few years ago. His wife just passed away, Esther, he was in prison for many years as being a spy. He was always encouraging him, writing letters. He'd go visit him in jail. He actually flew to America to meet two particular people, the Lubavitcher Rebbe and Jonathan Pollard. And unfortunately, he wasn't alive when Jonathan Pollard came out of jail in order to see that. So he was very, he believed the notion that one should not just attend the yeshiva full-time, but primarily to attend the yeshiva and as well as fight in the army. And I heard many lectures of his, and he was very much of the position to follow the Chardal movement, and where they had both a rabbinical world and as well as, associating themselves and actually being soldiers. He really, really believed in that completely. And his son actually has a yeshiva of Rechim and so on, following in his methodologies. So his legacy is still going on, and his publications, which I'll discuss later on. There's really so much of his particular world that we could discuss. He was, I want to get a little bit political. He was against the actual Gush Katif. I was actually in yeshiva there at Israel at the time in 2005 at the Israel disengagements in Gush Katif. He was really, really against that, and he believed that the state of Israel shouldn't have interfered with the people and literally physically take them out of their homes. Despite the fact that it was, considered, if they want to call it occupied or not occupied, or a part of the state of Israel, not a part of the state of Israel, however one wants to define it. He was just against the fact that how could a Jew take out a Jew from their home, despite the actual political position at the time. So that was one thing. So you could see him, he was extremely involved with the people. Whenever there was a major dilemma or major, call it Israel crisis, he was the first one to take thousands of people to the Kotel and pray on behalf of the Jewish people. So he was very, very involved with the people constantly. One of his things that stuck out to me was how he differentiated between Rabbi Ovadia Yosef, who he succeeded after Rabbi Ovadia Yosef as being a chief rabbi, a Rishon LeZion, in 1983 to 1993. The chief rabbi has approximately 10 years. It never existed like that until the 50s, and where it became literally every 10 years, where he succeeded, and he differentiates himself between the notion where Rabbi Ovadia Yosef was to have a universal Sephardic world, and while Rabbi Mordechai Eliyahu felt that I came from Iraq, or if a person comes from Morocco, you follow your Moroccan customs purely. And he felt if you're Algerian, you follow everything Algerian. In comparison to when people came to Israel, it sort of became a melting pot, especially for Sephardic Jews, where they follow Edut Mizrach and Yerushalmi prayers and so on. He felt not to follow in that approach and to completely follow your minhagim. Not that Rabbi Ovadia Yosef was against the minhagim, and that's where they differentiated. That they didn't meet eye to eye. There, of course, there were friends, there were colleagues, they went to the same yeshiva, and so on. But by having two different complete mindsets, gave them a complete different direction. Rabbi Ovadia Yosef was more a part of the ultra-Orthodox world, or Orthodox world, however you want to call it, the Haredi world, in comparison to Rabbi Mordechai Eliyahu was completely part of the Mizrahi world. But that doesn't make anyone better or worse, of course, without saying. It's just, I'm just trying to give a picture of where the different types of worlds come from. And I actually fit, I believe, in between both of them. So I'm not neither, I follow more of Rabbi Ovadia Yosef's methodologies, but in terms of I guess, call it political or outlooks of life, sort of absolute middle of the road. And his I have to share a story, a beautiful story that occurred in Porat Yosef. So all of a sudden, in Yeshiva Porat Yosef, if one has gone down those stairs, as I mentioned earlier, it used to be an open courtyard. It wasn't bricked up. There wasn't the wall. It was literally, you could see yeshiva students studying, and it was just maybe, a window, and you could pass by, the public was passing by it. And there's pictures one could go online and see, and literally pass by, and you would see classes going on of Yeshiva Porat Yosef as one is exiting and entering to the Western Wall, to the Kotel. So one day, all of a sudden, his teacher, Rabbi Mordechai Eliyahu, is giving a lecture, and he all of a sudden stands up. And he gets up, and then for like literally a minute, and then he sits back down. A student raises his hand and asks him, why'd you all of a sudden stand up in the middle of the shiur, in the middle of the lecture? He says, there was an elderly man that was passing by, and I love sharing this story, that he said that this person's from Baghdad. And I know that that the Ben Ish Chai was at this boy at the time, bar mitzvah, and the Ben Ish Chai donned tefillin on you, put tefillin on you. The fact that he touched him, and the fact that he touched him, the kedusha, the holiness, I stood up for him. Granted, that may not be the Ben Ish Chai, but the fact that he associated himself, he lived in his era, he physically touched him as he was putting and wrapping his tefillin on him, as that's the custom, at least in the Sephardic world, for the rabbi to don tefillin on the bar mitzvah boy. I stood up for him. And it was Rabbi Mordechai Eliyahu who asked that question. And there's two lessons that we could learn from that story. The first one, which is, in terms of inspiration, with the fact that it was holy, a holy person from a different era and so on. But the fact that Rabbi Mordechai Eliyahu asked that question instead of anyone else, and he was a youngster at the time, you see constantly, as I wrote this book and as I conducted my research and I met with family members and interviews and so on, that his complete sensitivity, as I mentioned earlier, to everything around him was just impeccable, just really, really amazing. And he was, every aspect that happened, I saw him pray on Sukkot, and the way he carried his love and etrog and talit, he really, really felt it. Sometimes we just do things when we go in with emotions of life, like anything. But here he truly felt the mitzvah. So here too, same thing. So I'll just move on within, there's so many stories that I could share. One, for example, was that, then I'll go back to his historical life, which is fascinating. He was, someone brought him a tea and he knocked it over by accident as he was giving a lecture. His sleeve, he was always wearing very often cufflinks or his actual, I guess, his rabbinical gown that he wore, the Harava Rashida Rishon, let's see, the beautiful one, his garment, he knocked it off, and at least once, twice, and then a third time. And then he said publicly, this is not for me. I'm not meant to drink this tea. Something is with this tea. All of a sudden, an Avrech, one of the Kolel men, got up, and they said that actually, that it's funny you're mentioning that, because we all make tea here and there should be no issues. So another person gets up and says, no, there is an issue, because there's someone here who's from Romania, one of the cleaners, one of the cleaning men, one of the janitors, and he occasionally cooks an egg on the actual pot. So everything became perfectly clear to him that that tea wasn't meant for him, because it would be an avera, a sin. So it's just his sensitivity and his foresight towards every small minutia of detail in Judaism was just fascinating. There's, in the 1960s, in particular, Rabbi Yitzchak Nissim, which is one of the best stories, not stories, I mean more episodes of his life, was conducted. And I'm actually going to screen share right now, and please, everybody, if they could see, let me know. Okay, so here, basically, don't mind everything else. Okay, just gonna get over here. Okay, great.
Yeah, you can comment in the chat that, to respond also. Just letting everybody
Yes, please. Okay, so let's go over here. I'm just gonna go to, so during this episode of his life, this is the book on the Chida, Rabbi Yehuda Azoulay, and I'm getting to the point of his episode in 1960. And in 1960, Rabbi Yitzchak Nissim, don't mind me as I'm doing this, Rabbi Yitzchak Nissim, the former Sephardic chief rabbi of the state of Israel, approached Rabbi Mordechai Eliyahu. Here, I'm coming up with it over here. And he basically approached him to move the Chida, Rabbi Yehuda Azoulay's body, from Italy to Jerusalem. Why would you do that at the time? It's in Italy, it's safe, and so on. But he felt, Rabbi Yitzchak Nissim felt, to bring his body over. Who did he approach? That's Rabbi Yitzchak Nissim, as you can see. And literally they're digging the grave of Rabbi Rabbi Chaim Yosef David Azoulay. These pictures, I actually got them from Italy, and this is conducted in Italy, and very rare footage, very rare pictures, as you can see. There's really phenomenal stories, which we'll get into. So this is as they're preparing in the cemetery and bringing the body to Yerushalayim. These are Bnei Akiva students carrying the Chida's body, and Rabbi Mordechai Eliyahu conducted everything here with Rabbi Yitzchak Nissim. This is a very interesting part of history. And as we move along, which you'll see, that's the chief rabbi of Italy, Rabbi Yitzchak Nissim. And this is, look, you can see here, thousands of people have brought in the Chida's body. That's over here, Rabbi Ovadia Hedaya, Rabbi Yitzchak Nissim, and Rabbi Mordechai Eliyahu is in the back over there. And you can see this entire entourage coming into Yerushalayim. Why am I bringing this up? And these are just very interesting, I guess, at the time, newspaper articles and so on. There's, let's go back here, where basically, it's fascinating, such a different world at the time. Bank HaPolim and many other private philanthropists actually donated to the Chida's burial and Ohel. He actually has an actual physical structure, and Rabbi Mordechai Eliyahu was actually buried next to him until today. And the fact that Bank HaPolim, philanthropists, government officials contributed towards the Ohel and the structure of the rabbi at the time is fascinating. So there's a famous story of Rabbi Mordechai Eliyahu with this, then we'll move on, was that Rabbi Yitzchak Nissim felt that Rabbi Mordechai Eliyahu was the best individual in the entire state of Israel to go ahead and conduct this. Famous story goes that Rabbi Mordechai Eliyahu put his hands in the coffin of the Chida of Rabbi Chaim Yosef David Azoulay and gave special prayers towards literally reshaping the body of the Chida. And he said, I'm sorry if I'm doing this wrong. There's a whole tefillah that he said. I published it in my book. And the fact that he did that was phenomenal. As he got to Yerushalayim, this is very scary, very emotional, however you want to call it and define it, was that as they got back to Yerushalayim, Rabbi Yitzchak Nissim said, check out the body. And as he checked out the body before they placed it in Yerushalayim, the body was actually intact, as if he just recently passed away. The Chida passed away over 200 years ago. So this story was only in the 1960s. Rabbi Mordechai Eliyahu has a video of him discussing this vaguely. He didn't want to get into details on YouTube, so you could see this. So this did exist, which is literally quite phenomenal. So I'll move further on, and we'll get questions later on without saying, is that there's the world of Rabbi Mordechai Eliyahu he had a very tough life. He was poor. He was an orphan. He was in a very unique position because he wasn't, again, a part of the ultra-Orthodox world. He wasn't a part of the secular world. So he had to have that defined balance within Judaism and within his world. And he really succeeded. He truly, truly succeeded. In 1983, as he became the chief rabbi of the state of Israel, his colleague, Rabbi Avraham Shapira, who was the Ashkenazi chief rabbi, together, literally hand by hand, took over the rabbinical position in the state of Israel. They really, really completed, I believe, one of the most, in terms of accomplishments, not in greatness, nobody could define that, in terms of accomplishments, than any other chief rabbi, in terms of building mikvahs, synagogues, schools, however you could define it. They literally accomplished so much that, to much credit of whatever you see in the state of Israel, especially from the religious components, whether you could see Sefer Torah in the middle of the Negev in an Israeli base, that could be because of these chief rabbis, that they made the centrality of Israel, and hopefully that won't change, where it's very religious influenced, and that's that. So there's really a lot in terms of his life and who he was, and there's really a special individual. I'm not sure if anyone here has had the opportunity to meet him, but a really sincere person in all aspects, and thank God I had the opportunity. He was a part of the school of thought, and as well as the approach of following the Arizal and Kabbalistic methodologies. And he followed the Arizal. His colleague and his teacher, was Rabbi Kaduri and the Baba Seli, while in comparison to other rabbis, were following the Maimonidean methodologies, more the rational methodology. So he was very into Kabbalah. He was an expert in circumcision, and as well as marriages. Literally, those were his main focuses, primarily in terms of study. And throughout anyone in the state of Israel, when there was a circumcision question that was extremely complicated, or a marriage one in particular, he was a complete expert in that field. So he wasn't just a rabbi for the state of Israel, but he focused on particular areas for the benefit of the Jewish people. And many of his grandchildren attended yeshiva. Many of his grandchildren attended the IDF. So I personally love this balance of this individual, of this rabbi. And it's very sad. It's very sad that you don't have these sensitive giants that exist today, as we lack them. We yearn for them. And that's why I write these books, as without their legacy, whether it's Sephardic, Ashkenaz, whatever it may be, we're living in a diluted society. And if we don't carry these methodologies, the way of teachings, and who they were and what they did, and their historical backgrounds, how they really came from nothing. Well, today we're spoiled. We have everything. Everything's instant. There's no social media at the time, without saying. So the fact that they came from that world, survived that world, and succeeded to become, whether a chief rabbi, leader, or anything of that sort in the state of Israel, is quite an accomplishment. And especially from a world of Iraq, especially from an impoverished world, an orphan, as I mentioned earlier. So these are the legacies that I like to bring over to the group, to the world, to my readers, followers, and this is something that I carry dear to my heart. And if there's any questions or anything of the sort, we could follow up.
First, thank you. I'm going to invite those who are here to join. One of the things I thought was interesting, and I just learned this, and I don't know if it was in effect at that point as well, but I'm sure that's not the only reason they brought the Chidah to Israel. But in Italy, you rent a grave, so that every few years you have to pay for the grave in Italy. I just found this out because a friend of my stepmom has somebody buried there, and they have to repay it, and they're trying to figure out what happens when, after 120 they have to. So I wonder if their timing came up too. So it was good timing. I'm just putting that out there.
I actually did not know that when I conducted my research, and I got hold of newspapers during that time, which most of that pictures are from newspapers from Livorno, Italy at the time. It was very hard research Rabbi Yitzhak Nissim had it in his archives in Yerushalayim and Jabotinsky Street. And I felt like I was just completely going back in time, which I personally loved, but I did not know that they rented it. So maybe after 200 years, it's a lot of rental.
Right, that's what I'm thinking. Look, I don't know at that time period. I just know that this, for this person, that was very recent. It was just a few months ago that I found that out. So I don't know how recent that is. So I don't see questions out there, so I'm going to keep talking because I do have a few things I wanted to bring up, but please, sure. I know you didn't come to hear me, so if there are any other questions, either put them into the chat or raise your hand and I'll invite you to open your microphone. Please open your cameras. I am inviting you to join, but we would love to have everybody join. That just because you're a panelist doesn't mean that you're going to be presenting. It just means that we see faces instead of a black screen in front of us. So first I wanted to say, what made you get into all this research?
Okay, great question. And I don't know the time frame that we have remaining, so I could speak for hours.
Another 15, 20 minutes, that's up to you.
But I'm not. I won't be too long, and I won't be lengthy at all. So basically, I was 18 years old, and I'll be brief, was that it really bothered me where I would travel to universities, archives, museums, Judaica stores, library, like anything that had to do with education. And I was, I would say 18 years old. In Israel, it started. Nowhere else in Israel, particularly in Yerushalayim and Jerusalem. I was in yeshiva, particularly in a Sephardic yeshiva called Migdash Melech, an American Sephardic yeshiva. And I went to the Rosh Hashiva and I said, Rabbi, I don't understand. I cannot go anywhere. I can't find anything on English literature on Sephardic Judaism, more on rabbinical history. It did exist. I'm talking about 17 years ago, so it's quite a while. And he says, yeah, unfortunately, he says, so you should do it. And if not now, then when? And I'm like, you know what? I'll do it. And then 2 years later, I gave him a manuscript. He was shocked. He says 99% of the people just talk. So you actually pulled through. So I came up with a book by around 20 or 21. And it was a light version of history on 25 rabbis. But it's funny how God does things. It was 25 rabbis on their history and a few stories, a very basic book. And as I went along within other publications, my literature became more articulate, my more well-written as I went to university. I went to Yeshiva University. And by the time I was actually doing my master's degree, and as I was doing my master's degree in Yeshiva University, I'll never forget, every single day at 1 a.m, I was writing my book on the Ben Ish Chai. And I'll never forget that. And you could see the literary, how shall I say, quality in comparison to the other books when I was 18. And then when I was in Yeshiva University, which was not too long ago, I had the different levels, of course. So I guess one could appreciate, if one appreciates, the actual grammar and so on, so that was at the Ben Ish Chai. So it's funny, I carried this with my heart. I saw and I was influenced from family and friends, particularly from Toronto, Canada, where there's a large Moroccan community, and where I'm from, where it influenced me, my rabbis, and the hilulot, the events, the community. And without that experience of having an authentic Sephardic and Moroccan experience, 100% these publications wouldn't have existed at all. And it's sad because if I could have focused on other things and been selfish and done other work, because these are not money makers at all. But thank God they do well in terms of selling. And I actually just distributed 150 books of Maran for free to 150 American Sephardic congregations, literally shipped out last week for free. And I put a sticker in there with the contact information, and then I'll be doing Europe and other countries later on. My goal is literally to primarily preserve Sephardic Judaism for the rest of my life. I started off with rabbis because there's a lack of information on them. I have an encyclopedia coming out with Dr. Bracha Speyer from Jerusalem, as she's an assistant professor. And the book, the actual 6 volumes is done, which I could discuss later on. I've done events in Congress to promote Sephardic Judaism, but it's not the point is to get involved politically or whatever it may be. It's to get the message out, whether educationally, politically, through books, through eventually I'm going to be doing media. So, heavily I'm going to be doing documentary films and so on. But I have a certain amount of works, as we've discussed in the past. Personally, we've discussed where I have a certain, goals in terms to achieve. If I saw that they weren't selling, well, I actually would have absolutely stopped. But I push it in many different aspects in terms of marketing, and many complimentary books. And thank God I have a lot of sponsors that really, really back me for many different communities. So I'm very, very grateful from all different backgrounds. And it's really appreciate this to have that support. Otherwise, these publications would have never existed. So that's more or less it. But there's a lot more to it. But in a nutshell, that's pretty much that.
Well, I do want to also point out before I forget that this is from the Sephardic Legacy series, and as you can see, this is only one of the books in the series, and I want to make sure that people are aware of it because it really is a treasure trove of the Sephardic heritage, which is really the Jewish heritage, and that's why we talk about a lot that it's part of the Jewish experience rather than the Sephardi experience. It's part of all of us. So I do want to point that out.
Absolutely.
So I'm also going to send you the link in the follow-up emails.
You mentioned the experience, if I may elaborate. Yeah. Is I love always talking about, I was actually just reading the history of the German Jewry. Crazy in terms of so different in comparison to the Sephardic world. So I'm starting to get into that world as I'm, and it's very interesting. Their history is particularly 1,300 years old. And it's the entire story, like you said, the entire experience. The biggest problem that the Sephardic Jews had was that we lacked the content, period. And we would open up, I don't want to say certain historians, where they would have their Jewish publications going out to schools and seminaries and yeshivas and high schools, elementary schools, whatever it may be. And literally he would write, this particular person with no names would write an entire book of Jewish history, when he would maybe give a page or two to Sephardic history. But one doesn't know, if one knows their geography, Jewish history started, I'm not going to call it Sephardic, but started in Middle East and North Africa as, Abraham Avinu and so on. So to not have that, you have to say the whole story. You're taking chapters out of Jewish history. We have to have the entire Jewish experience, whether it's German, Polish, Hungarian, and so on, whatever it may be. That is what makes us, a beautiful Jewish nation. So that's, I think, the biggest challenge that I was seeing and that we lack is the proper history, especially in English. I'm going to be pushing it towards French and Spanish. Many of my books are in French and Spanish as well, but I was frustrated. I was truly, truly frustrated with having a lack of information. And if it would have been German, maybe I would have connected to that. I don't know, probably not, because I'm not of a German ancestry. But still, to have that experience, you said the right word, and it's the whole story, it's the whole experience. So just thought to throw that out, of course, without saying.
There's a question here. Can you please speak about Rabbi Eliyahu's literary output?
Literary, sorry?
Output. Like, what did he write? The things that he wrote.
He wrote Rabbi Mordechai. He wrote many books on Taharat HaMishpacha, which is
Family purity.
Family purity, correct. That's the best words in English. Yes, correct. He spoke, as I mentioned, he published a lot on circumcision. He actually did not publish too much, believe it or not. Not like Rabbi Ovadia Yosef, who wrote 58 publications and so on. Someone asked him, why don't you publish much? I believe he published 8 books approximately, but that's still quite a bit. And he says, I'd rather spend my time with the people. So I love that. He was a people's person. And to me, that just warms my heart. And he took away from publishing and being, can't call it selfish, but rather he focused on that. So he really wasn't, by definition, a major author. He certainly published, and they're trying to put manuscripts. So right now they're putting something together where he gave commentary on the Zohar. So he has literally some notes, and they're going to be putting that together. So he did not write excessively, but certainly a nice amount of publications, like you said, Taharat HaMishpacha, Family Purity, Circumcision, on the Torah, and many others. And Feldheim actually published and translated a few from Hebrew to English as well. So you could find that online.
And I think that's true in a few different cases in Sephardic Jewry. It's a much more human interaction, much more people-based. And so we don't have as much publications that came with us, besides the fact that a bunch of them were in Arabic. That's a different story. But even more recently, I know I was talking about it with my husband the other day, that it just seems so much richer, the literary output of the Ashkenazim, and yet it's not. It's
correct. Well, the interesting, and thank you, Brandon. I see your message. My pleasure. I want to mention something that is crucial, and I don't want to take up too much of your time to the group here as we wrap things up. Is that the interesting thing, as based on conducting my research, and I've not seen too much. I've not done research on the Ashkenazim pairing. Of course not, but certainly the rabbinical true and authentic rabbis were ones that worked, were ones that learned, were ones that were completely educated, were ones that were multitasked in being circumcision, doing everything and being a shochet. And you could see that throughout if one does real, true research. And going over the years, and I read excessively, that is a true Sephardic rabbi. I can't talk about other rabbis and other backgrounds, but I could talk on behalf of my lineage and my background, where basically, to me, that is so amazing. And I believe that did exist in the European world as well. I think what ended up happening is that throughout time and throughout other influences, people just became extreme, where it's just one. The concept of kollel did exist, but it existed with working as well. Having a supplementary job, even for those 2-3 hours, as even the Chafetz Chaim from Radin, from Poland, had a store, had a grocery store, but that person ended up becoming not just a grocery store owner, the Chafetz Chaim. It's the same thing here. And I think we have a misconception today, and we lack that true identity of who Rabbi truly is in 2022. And that's why I love talking about the past. People always ask me, well, why don't you write about rabbis today? I said, what's there to write? So
there are some today. I
no,
don't
I'm
want
just
to.
joking. I'm joking. I'm joking. Of course there is, but nothing of the past. Without saying no, of course there's wonderful. I will not belittle what we have today. But
well, we really appreciate it. Thank you so much for joining. Thank you all those who came today and all those who are watching afterwards. And thank you for working with us on this. And thank you for everything you do. Just really wonderful. So thank you. Have a great rest of your day, everyone.
Thank you so much. A true honor. Thank you, everyone. Appreciate it. Thank you.
We'll talk soon.